Sometimes the ones nobody wants turn out to be the ones who save us. At a stockyard shelter outside Lonesome Bluff, every buyer walked past the smallest, saddest donkey foal in the pen. She had trembling legs, sad eyes, and no future. But Amos Rigg, a 67-year-old retired cowboy, saw something different. While others searched for strength, he knelt and chose the one everyone said wouldn't last. He named her Gracie. What happened next stunned the entire county. With patient hands and quiet belief, Amos gave Gracie a second chance. But when fire swept through his stables one night, Gracie refused to leave him behind. What made the broken foal risk everything to save the man who believed in her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun stretched long across the stockyard shelter on the edge of Lonesome Bluff, casting shadows through the weathered fence posts. Dust hung in the air like fine gold powder, catching the light in ways that made everything look older than it was. The place smelled of hay and animal warmth, mixed with the faint tang of disinfectant that never quite covered the reality of what the shelter was, a last stop for creatures nobody wanted. Amos Rigg had driven his old Ford pickup down the rutted road that morning without any particular plan. At 67, he had learned that the best decisions often came without much planning at all. His ranch, 12 miles outside town, had grown quiet in recent years. Too quiet. The horses he'd once trained were long sold or passed. The cattle operation he'd run with his late wife had dwindled to nothing. Now it was just him and 20 acres that felt emptier every season. He parked near the main barn, his boots raising small clouds as he stepped onto the packed earth. The shelter manager, a woman named Caroline West, who'd known him since she was a girl, looked up from her clipboard with surprise. "Amos Rigg," she said, pushing gray-streaked hair from her face. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here," he replied, tipping his hat. The gesture was automatic, bred into him by a mother who believed manners mattered more than money. Woke up this morning and the barn felt wrong. Empty stall, been sitting there 3 years now since old Copper passed. Figured it was time. Caroline studied him with the directness of someone who'd spent 40 years reading animals and the people who came for them. "You looking for a horse?" Maybe something else. Don't rightly know yet," she smiled, the kind of smile that held both understanding and a touch of sadness. "Well, you've come to the right place for not knowing. We've got plenty of possibilities, some better than others." They walked together past the main pens where the more adoptable animals were kept. A few good horses stood near the fence, their coats gleaming in the morning light. Strong backs, clear eyes, the kind of animals that would find homes by week's end. Amos barely glanced at them. Caroline noticed, but said nothing. Beyond the main area, past a rusted gate that creaked when Caroline pushed it open, lay the back pens. This was where they kept the problem cases, the ones too old, too sick, too wild, or too broken to interest the average buyer. Most would never leave this place except in the back of a truck, headed somewhere no one wanted to think about. "Had a mare come in last Tuesday," Caroline said, gesturing toward a lean chestnut in the corner pen. "Owner died, no family wanted her. She's got some years left, gentle disposition." But Amos had stopped walking. His attention had caught on something else entirely. In the smallest pen, separated from the others, stood a donkey foal that looked like it had given up on the world. She couldn't have been more than 4 months old, all awkward angles and protruding ribs. Her grey coat was dull, patchy in places, and her legs seemed barely strong enough to hold her upright. But it was her eyes that held Amos, dark, deep, and filled with a sadness that seemed far too old for such a young creature. "That one there," he said quietly. "What's her story?" Caroline's expression shifted, a mix of sympathy and resignation. "Found her 3 weeks ago on the Barlow property after they went into foreclosure. Mother rejected her at birth, too weak to nurse properly. We've been bottle feeding, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Amos, she's not thriving. We've done everything we can, but sometimes an animal just doesn't have the will to go on. The vet says her heart's fine, her lungs are clear, but she's fading anyway. Sometimes that happens when they've been rejected. They just give up. She got a name? We've been calling her 47. That's her intake number. Amos walked closer to the pen, his movements slow and deliberate. The foal watched him approach but didn't retreat. Didn't come forward either. Just stood there, trembling slightly, as if the effort of standing took everything she had. How long she got? He asked. Caroline sighed, the sound carrying the weight of too many animals she couldn't save. Week, maybe 2. We're keeping her comfortable, but unless something changes, there's no future here. I'm sorry, Amos. I know that look on your face. I've seen it before when people think they can save every broken thing they find. But this one's too far gone. Mind if I go in? Be my guest, but be careful. She's unpredictable. Not aggressive, just broken. Amos unlatched the gate and stepped into the pen. The foal's ears twitched, but she didn't move. He approached slowly, the way he'd approached countless skittish animals over 5 decades of ranch work. When he was close enough, he knelt in the dust, bringing himself down to her level. His knees protested. Arthritis had been his companion for the past 10 years, but he ignored it. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. His voice was gravelly, worn smooth by years of talking to animals who listened better than most people. "Rough start you've had." The foal's dark eyes met his. In that moment, Amos saw something that Caroline had missed, something the vet's instruments couldn't measure. The spark was still there, buried deep beneath layers of neglect and abandonment, but there. A tiny flame that refused to go out completely. He extended his hand slowly, palm up, letting her catch his scent. The foal's nostrils flared. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then so tentatively it was almost imperceptible, she took a single step forward. Then another. Her small muzzle touched his palm, warm and soft despite the rough patches on her coat. "That's a girl," Amos murmured. "That's all I needed to know." He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the dust, while the foal stood close enough to feel his presence. He ran his weathered hands gently along her neck, feeling every rib, every jutting bone. She was in bad shape, no question about it, but Amos had learned something important over the years: the difference between an animal that was dying and one that was waiting for a reason to live. When he finally stood and walked back to where Caroline waited, his decision was already made. "I'll take her," he said. Caroline blinked. "Amos, I don't think you heard me. She's not going to make it. You'll be taking home an animal that'll break your heart inside a month. Maybe. But that's my heart to break, not yours. There are better options. That mare I showed you, or we've got a good gelding that came in last week. Strong, healthy animals that could give you years of companionship." Amos shook his head. "I appreciate that, Caroline, I do. But I'm not looking for strong or healthy right now. I'm looking for something that needs what I've got to give. That little one in there, she's been passed over her whole short life. Her mama didn't want her. The people who found her couldn't keep her. And now she's sitting in a pen waiting to fade away because nobody believes she's worth the trouble." He paused, looking back at the small figure still standing where he'd left her. "I've got an empty stall, and I've got time, and I've got patience. Maybe that's not enough, but it's what I have. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what she needs." Caroline's expression softened. She'd known Amos since she was 8 years old, had watched him work with animals that other trainers had given up on. He'd never been the flashy type, never broke records or won championships. But he had something rarer, a genuine understanding that every creature deserved to be seen, truly seen, for what it was rather than what it failed to be. "All right," she said finally, "but I need you to understand something. The vet bills alone could run you more than she's worth by any practical measure. And there's no guarantee. She could pass tomorrow, next week, next month. You'd be taking on a lot of heartache for very little return." "Return?" Amos smiled, the expression crinkling the weathered lines around his eyes. "Caroline, I'm 67 years old. My wife's been gone 5 years. My son lives in Denver and calls every other month if I'm lucky. I wake up every morning to a house that echoes and a barn that feels like a tomb. I'm not looking for a return on investment. I'm looking for something to care about again. That little foal in there, she needs someone to believe in her. And I need something to believe in. Seems like we might be able to help each other out." Caroline pulled out her paperwork, shaking her head with a small smile. "You're a stubborn man, Amos Rigg." That's what my wife used to say, usually right before admitting I was right about something. They handled the formalities: adoption papers, health records, care instructions. Caroline threw in a supply of the special formula they'd been feeding her, along with detailed notes from the vet about her condition and prognosis. The outlook wasn't encouraging, but Amos took the papers without reading them too closely. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the experts knew the science but missed the spirit. Loading the foal into his trailer proved easier than expected. She followed him with that same tentative trust she'd shown in the pen, her small hooves clicking against the metal ramp. Amos had lined the trailer with extra straw, made sure the space was clean and as comfortable as he could make it. The foal stood in the center, swaying slightly with the movement of the truck, her eyes wide but not panicked. The drive back to the ranch took 40 minutes. Amos drove slowly, careful of every bump and turn. Through the trailer window, he could see the foal's small form, still standing, still holding on. The New Mexico landscape rolled past. Red earth, scattered juniper, distant mesas that had watched over this land for millennia. The sky was that particular shade of blue that seemed to exist nowhere else. So bright it almost hurt to look at directly. His property sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through low hills covered in sage and prairie grass. The house was modest, a single-story ranch style, with a wraparound porch that his wife Margaret had insisted on 30 years ago. The barn stood 50 yards away, built by his grandfather in 1942 and maintained with care ever since. Paint peeled in places and the roof could use patching, but the structure was sound. That's what mattered. Amos backed the trailer up to the barn entrance and cut the engine. For a moment he just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, wondering if he'd made a foolish decision. At his age, he should be simplifying his life, not taking on projects that would demand time and energy he wasn't sure he had anymore. But when he looked in the rearview mirror and saw those sad eyes watching him through the trailer window, he knew there'd been no other choice to make. The foal unloaded as quietly as she'd loaded, following him into the barn with small, careful steps. Amos had prepared the empty stall that morning before he'd even realized what he was doing. Fresh straw, clean water bucket, a salt lick mounted on the wall. The stall that had held Copper for 16 years and had stood vacant since the old horse had laid down for the last time 3 winters ago. He led the foal inside and closed the gate gently. She stood in the center of the stall, looking around with those ancient eyes, taking in her new surroundings with an expression Amos couldn't quite read. "Need to give you a proper name," he said, leaning against the stall door. "Can't be calling you 47. That's not a name for a living thing." The foal turned her head toward him, ears forward, and in that moment Amos saw it again. That tiny spark of something more than survival, something that wanted, despite everything, to become whatever it was meant to be. "Gracie," he said softly. "That was my mother's name. Strongest woman I ever knew. She'd have liked you, I think. Would have seen what I see." He paused, testing the name. "Gracie, that suit you?" The foal took a step toward him, close enough that he could reach through the slats and touch her muzzle. Her breath was warm against his palm. "All right then," Amos said. "Gracie it is. Welcome home, girl. Welcome home." The first 3 days nearly broke him. Gracie wouldn't eat. The special formula Caroline had provided sat untouched in the bucket Amos had carefully prepared. He tried bottle feeding, hand feeding, even mixing the formula with molasses to make it more appealing. Nothing worked. The foal would sniff at whatever he offered, then turn away, retreating to the far corner of her stall, where she stood with her head lowered, as if the weight of simply existing had become too much to bear. Amos spent those nights in the barn, sleeping on a cot he'd dragged from the house. His back complained, his joints ached, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her alone. Every few hours he'd wake and check on her, expecting to find her collapsed in the straw. Each time she was still standing, barely but standing, that small act of defiance against what seemed inevitable. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Tom Hartley's patrol car pulled up the drive. Tom had been friends with Amos for 40 years, had stood beside him at Margaret's funeral, had checked in regularly ever since. He stepped out of the car with 2 coffees and a concerned expression. "Caroline called me," Tom said, handing Amos a cup. "Said you took home that dying foal." "Said she was worried about you." They stood together on the porch, drinking coffee in the early light. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain that might or might not come. "I'm fine," Amos said. "That's what you always say." Tom took a long sip, his eyes on the barn. "You sleeping out there?" "She shouldn't be alone, Amos." Tom's voice carried the weight of friendship and worry. "You're 67 years old. You can't save them all. Hell, from what Caroline tells me, you can't save this one. She's failing, and you sitting out there on a cot isn't going to change that. Maybe not. But she'll know she wasn't alone at the end." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret would tell you you're being stubborn. Margaret would be right there in the barn with me, probably making me move the cot so she could sleep closer to the stall." That brought a small smile to Tom's weathered face. "Yeah, she would have at that." He finished his coffee, crushed the cup, and turned to face his friend directly. "Just promise me you'll call Doc Peterson if things go south. Don't let her suffer because you can't let go, I promise." After Tom left, Amos went back to the barn. Gracie was lying down for the first time since she'd arrived, her legs folded beneath her, her breathing shallow. He entered the stall slowly and sat down in the straw beside her. "She didn't move away. I know you're tired," he said softly, resting his hand on her neck. "I know it feels like there's no point. Your mama didn't want you. The world hasn't been kind. And now here you are, with some old cowboy who probably doesn't know what he's doing." He paused, feeling the faint flutter of her heartbeat beneath his palm. "But here's the thing, Gracie. I see you. Not what you're supposed to be, not what other folks think you should be. I see who you are right now, right here. And that's enough for me." "That's more than enough." The foal's eye rolled toward him, dark and liquid, still holding that deep sadness. But something shifted in her gaze, something Amos felt more than saw. "I'm not giving up on you," he continued. "I know that doesn't mean much coming from someone you just met. But I made a promise when I brought you home, and I keep my promises. So you can rest if you need to. You can take all the time you want. But I'll be right here, and I'll be here tomorrow and the day after that, and as long as it takes." He stayed there in the straw, his hand on her neck, feeling her breathe. After a while, he started talking again. About Margaret, about the horses he'd trained, about his son who'd left for the city and never quite came back, about the way the land looked at sunrise, the sound of rain on the barn roof, the satisfaction of a job done right, even if nobody was watching. He talked about everything and nothing, his voice a steady current in the quiet barn. Hours passed. The light changed as the sun moved across the sky, casting different patterns through the barn's high windows. Amos's legs went numb from sitting, but he didn't move. And slowly, so slowly he almost missed it, Gracie's breathing began to even out. The tension in her small body eased by degrees. When evening came, Amos prepared another bottle of formula. He'd long since given up expecting her to take it, but he went through the motions anyway, warming it to the right temperature, testing it on his wrist the way he'd learned to do years ago for orphaned calves. He sat back down beside Gracie and offered it without hope, just habit. The foal's nostrils flared, catching the scent. Amos waited, holding the bottle steady. Then, with a movement so tentative it seemed like the world held its breath, Gracie lifted her head. Her lips touched the nipple. She pulled back, uncertain. Amos kept the bottle where it was, not pushing, just offering. Gracie tried again. This time she latched on, and for the first time in 4 days, she began to drink. Amos felt his throat tighten. Tears he hadn't known were there, blurring his vision. It wasn't much. She only managed a few ounces before pulling away, exhausted by even that small effort. But it was something. It was a beginning. "That's my girl," he whispered. "That's my good girl." Over the next week, Gracie began to improve. Not dramatically, not the kind of miraculous recovery that made for easy stories. She gained strength in small increments, standing for longer periods, drinking a bit more at each feeding, eventually taking a few steps around her stall without that terrible wobbling that had marked her first days. Her coat remained dull, her frame gaunt, but her eyes began to clear. The sadness didn't disappear entirely, but it retreated, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. Word spread through Lonesome Bluff, as word always did in small towns. The feed store clerk asked about the foal when Amos came in for supplies. The veterinarian, old Doc Peterson, stopped by unannounced to check on her, bringing his bag and a skeptical expression that softened when he saw Gracie actually moving around her stall. "Well," Doc said, straightening up after his examination, "didn't think I'd be saying this, but she's got a fighting chance. Still touch and go, mind you. She's got a long road ahead. But whatever you're doing, keep doing it." But not everyone was supportive. At the diner where Amos took breakfast twice a week, he overheard Bobby Strickland, a younger rancher with opinions about everything, holding forth to a table of his friends. "Heard old Amos Riggs gone soft," Bobby was saying, loud enough that half the diner could hear. "Took home a reject foal that should have been put down humanely. Now he's pouring money into keeping it alive when any sensible person can see there's no point." That's what happens when you get old and lonely. You start making decisions with your heart instead of your head. Amos had kept eating his eggs, but Bobby's words had stung more than he wanted to admit. Not because he doubted his decision, he didn't, but because he knew there was truth in what people were thinking. He was old. He was lonely, and maybe he was trying to fill a hole in his life that a broken foal couldn't possibly fill. That night, back in the barn, he sat on the rail of Gracie's stall and watched her sleep. She was curled in the straw, breathing steadily, looking almost peaceful. The medicine bottles lined up on the shelf, supplements, vitamins, antibiotics for an infection that had cropped up in her second week, represented a significant chunk of his fixed income. The feed specially formulated for her needs cost twice what regular feed did. Doc Peterson had been kind enough to only charge for supplies, not labor, but the bills were adding up. His son, Kyle, had called the previous evening. Somehow he'd heard about Gracie, probably from Tom, who meant well but couldn't keep anything to himself. "Dad," Kyle had said, his voice carrying that careful tone people used when they thought they were dealing with someone losing their grip on reality. "Is this about Mom? Because if you're trying to fill that space, maybe you should think about other options. Get a dog. Join one of those senior groups in town. But taking on a dying animal, that's not healthy." Amos hadn't known how to explain that it wasn't about filling Margaret's space. It was about finding his own purpose in days that had started to blend together into one long stretch of emptiness. It was about waking up with something to do that mattered, even if it only mattered to him and one small, damaged creature. "I'm fine, Kyle," he'd said. "I know what I'm doing. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're setting yourself up for heartbreak." Maybe he was. Probably he was. But as Amos sat there watching Gracie breathe, watching her twitch in dreams he hoped were better than her waking reality had been, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. Whatever happened, however this ended, these weeks hadn't been empty. They'd meant something. That was more than his days had meant in a long time. 3 weeks into Gracie's time at the ranch, Amos hung his work gloves on their usual peg by the barn door and allowed himself to feel something he'd been careful not to feel before. Hope. The transformation hadn't been dramatic. Gracie still looked underfed, her ribs still visible beneath her patchy coat, but she'd gained weight. More importantly, she'd gained spirit. Where before she'd stood motionless for hours, now she moved around her stall with increasing confidence. Where before she'd turned away from human contact, now she greeted Amos each morning with a soft bray that was becoming familiar, almost musical in its awkwardness. The routine they'd established was simple but consuming. Amos rose before dawn, heated the formula to exactly the right temperature, and brought it to the barn where Gracie would be waiting at the gate. She learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps, would perk her ears and shift her weight in anticipation. After feeding, he'd brush her coat, gently, always gently, working around the tender spots where her skin was still raw. She'd lean into the brush strokes, a low rumble of contentment vibrating in her chest. Then came the walks. Just around the barn at first, Gracie's legs still unsteady, Amos moving at her pace with the lead rope held loose. But each day she managed a bit more. By the end of the third week, they'd made it all the way to the corral fence and back, a distance of maybe 50 yards that left her exhausted but visibly pleased with herself. During these walks, Amos talked. He'd always talked to animals. Margaret used to tease him about having better conversations with horses than with people. But with Gracie, it felt different. She listened in a way that seemed almost human, her large ears swiveling toward him, her eyes tracking his face as if trying to understand not just the sounds, but the meaning behind them. "You know what I think?" he said one morning as they completed their circuit. "I think you understand more than folks give you credit for. I think that's what broke your heart in the first place. You knew you weren't wanted. Animals know. They feel it same as people do, maybe more clearly, because they don't lie to themselves about it." Gracie bumped his shoulder with her nose, a gesture that had become her way of responding when he spoke. The town's skepticism began to shift as word spread that the foal was actually improving. Caroline from the shelter stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on her records, but really to see for herself. She stood by the corral fence, watching Gracie navigate the space with Amos nearby, and shook her head in quiet amazement. "I'll admit it," she said. "I didn't think you had a prayer. I've seen too many animals in her condition, and they just don't come back from that edge. But look at her. She's actually thriving." "Not thriving yet," Amos corrected gently. "But getting there. One day at a time. What's your secret?" Amos thought about that. No secret. Just time and attention. And maybe believing she was worth the effort, even when she didn't believe it herself. Caroline smiled. "You always were good at seeing potential where others saw problems. I remember that Mustang you worked with, the one everyone said was too wild to gentle. What was his name?" "Thunder. And he wasn't too wild, he was too smart. People mistake intelligence for stubbornness in animals. They're not wrong exactly, but they're not right either. But not all the attention was positive." Bobby Strickland showed up uninvited one Saturday morning, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled into the drive with more speed than necessary. He climbed out wearing his usual cocky expression and walked straight to where Amos was working with Gracie in the corral. "Wanted to see for myself," Bobby said, hooking his thumbs in his belt loops. "Everyone in town's talking about Amos Rigg and his miracle donkey." "Not a miracle," Amos replied evenly. "Just patience." Bobby circled the corral, his eyes assessing Gracie with the cold calculation of someone who saw animals as commodities rather than creatures. "Still looks half dead to me. How much you sunk into this project so far? Between vet bills and special feed and your time, I'm guessing you're in the hole a couple thousand at least. Not keeping a ledger. Maybe you should be. At your age, on your income, throwing money at something that'll never be worth anything seems foolish to me." Amos felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice calm. "Good thing it's not your money or your decision, then." "Fair enough. But when this thing finally gives up, and it will, don't expect sympathy. You can't save everything, old man. Some things are just meant to fail." After Bobby left, Amos stood by the fence for a long time, his hands gripping the weathered wood. The young rancher's words echoed in his head, mixing with Kyle's concerns and the doubts that surfaced in the dark hours of night when Gracie's breathing seemed too shallow, when every small setback felt like the beginning of the end. Gracie approached the fence and pressed her muzzle against his arm. Amos ran his hand along her face, feeling the warmth of her, the realness of her. "He's wrong," Amos said quietly. "You're not meant to fail. Neither of us are." That afternoon, Doc Peterson arrived for his weekly checkup. He'd taken a personal interest in Gracie's recovery, partly from professional curiosity. Cases like hers didn't usually have happy endings, and partly because he'd known Amos long enough to appreciate what this foal meant to him. The examination was thorough. Doc listened to Gracie's heart and lungs, checked her legs and joints, palpated her stomach, examined her eyes and gums. When he finished, he packed his bag slowly, choosing his words with care. "She's improved beyond anything I expected," he said. Her vitals are stronger, she's gaining weight steadily, and the infection's cleared up completely. But Amos, I need you to understand something. She's still fragile. Donkeys are hardy animals as a rule, but she started so far behind that she may never be truly healthy. She could live a long life, or she could take a turn tomorrow. There's no guarantee, I understand. Do you? Because I've seen people form attachments to animals, they're nursing back to health. They pour everything into the recovery, and when it doesn't work out, it breaks them. I don't want that to happen to you. Amos met the old veterinarian's eyes. Doc, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a child who doesn't understand loss. I've buried my wife, watched good horses grow old and pass, lived long enough to know that nothing's permanent. If Gracie only has a few more months, then I'll give her the best few months I can. And if she has years, even better. But either way, these weeks haven't been wasted. They've mattered. Doc nodded slowly. Just wanted to make sure you knew what you were in for. Keep doing what you're doing. Whatever it is, it's working better than medicine. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Amos led Gracie out to the pasture for the first time. It was only an acre, fenced and safe, but to the foal who'd spent her entire life in pens and stalls, it might as well have been the whole world. She stood at the gate, nostrils flaring, taking in the smells of grass and earth and open space. Go on, Amos encouraged, releasing the lead rope. It's yours. For a moment, Gracie didn't move. Then, with a suddenness that surprised them both, she took off. Not running, not yet strong enough for that, but moving faster than Amos had seen her move before. She circled the pasture, her gait awkward but joyful, kicking up her heels in a way that was more enthusiasm than coordination. And for the first time since he'd met her, Amos heard her bray with something that sounded remarkably like happiness. He leaned against the fence and watched her, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. The work gloves in his back pocket, stained and worn from years of ranch work and now from weeks of caring for Gracie, felt like a badge of honor. Every stain was a memory, every worn spot a testament to work that mattered. Maybe Bobby was right about the money. Maybe Kyle was right about the risk. Maybe everyone who thought he was making a foolish decision had logic on their side. But as Amos watched Gracie discover what it meant to have space and freedom, and someone who believed in her, he knew with absolute certainty that some things mattered more than logic. Some things were worth every risk, every dollar, every sleepless night. And this small, damaged creature who was learning to trust again was one of those things. The cold snap came in early October, bringing with it winds that rattled the barn doors and sent temperatures dropping 20 degrees overnight. Amos woke before dawn to check on Gracie and found her shivering in her stall despite the extra bedding he'd laid down the night before. He went to the house and returned with something he'd kept in the cedar chest for 5 years, unable to use it, but unable to let it go. Margaret's favorite blanket. It was wool, cream-colored, with a blue border that she'd embroidered herself with small flowers. She'd kept it on the back of the couch, wrapping herself in it during winter evenings when they'd sit together watching the fire. Amos stood in the barn holding the blanket, feeling the weight of memory in his hands. He could still see Margaret on the couch, her reading glasses perched on her nose, the blanket pulled up to her chin while she worked through her mystery novels. She'd loved those books, would get so absorbed in them that he'd have to call her name twice before she heard him. She'd want you to have this, he said to Gracie, draping the blanket carefully over the foal's back. She always had a soft spot for creatures that needed care. Would have loved you, I think. The blanket was too large, trailing in the straw, but Gracie seemed to understand its purpose. She settled down with a contented sound, the warmth enveloping her small frame. Amos adjusted the fabric, tucking it around her shoulders, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not grief, not exactly, but a kind of release. As if Margaret was telling him it was all right, that holding on didn't mean keeping everything frozen in place. Over the next few days, the blanket became Gracie's constant companion. Amos would find her standing with it draped across her back, or lying with it bunched beneath her like a nest. The cream wool became streaked with dirt and straw, the careful embroidery growing faded, and somehow that felt right. The blanket had new purpose now, a different kind of love keeping it worn and useful. Tom Hartley stopped by one afternoon and noticed the blanket immediately. He didn't say anything at first, just stood looking at it while Amos brushed Gracie's coat. Finally he spoke. "That's Margaret's blanket." "It is. Kyle know you gave it to the foal?" "Hasn't come up in conversation." Tom was quiet for a moment. "He called me last week. Asked if I thought you were all right. Mentioned you'd been acting different since you brought this one home." Amos continued brushing, long, steady strokes that Gracie leaned into. "Different how?" "Obsessed was the word he used. Said you don't answer the phone half the time. That you're spending money you don't have. That you've given away his mother's things to an animal." Tom paused. "His words, not mine. What do you think?" Tom walked closer, his experienced eyes taking in the scene, the clean stall, the careful arrangement of feeding supplies, the way Gracie clearly trusted Amos completely. "I think you're the clearest I've seen you in 5 years. I think this foal's given you something you needed. But I also think Kyle's scared. He lost his mother, and now he's worried he's losing his father too. He's in Denver. Has been for 15 years. Visits maybe twice a year. I talk to him more now than I did before Margaret passed. Doesn't mean he doesn't care. Doesn't mean he's wrong to worry." Amos set down the brush and faced his friend. "Tom, I know what people think. Old man living alone. Can't let go of his dead wife. Pours all his energy into saving something that can't be saved. I know how it looks. But this isn't about replacing Margaret. It's not about avoiding grief or filling some void. It's about..." He struggled to find the words. "When Margaret died, I thought I died too, in a way. Not physically, but everything that made life worth living felt like it ended with her. I was just going through the motions, waiting for it to be over. Then I walked into that shelter and saw those eyes, and something woke up inside me. Something I thought was gone for good." He looked at Gracie, who'd come to the stall door and was watching them with those intelligent eyes. She needed someone to believe in her when nobody else did. And I needed something to believe in again. Is that obsession? Maybe. But it's also the first time in 5 years I've woken up actually wanting to face the day. Tom put a hand on his shoulder. "Then I'm glad you found her. But maybe give Kyle a call. Let him hear what you just told me. He's your son, Amos. He deserves to understand." After Tom left, Amos did call Kyle. The conversation started awkward, stilted, the way their talks always seemed to go. But when Amos explained about Gracie, really explained, not just the surface details, but what she meant, Kyle listened. For the first time in years, they talked for more than 15 minutes. It didn't solve everything. Kyle still thought his father was taking on too much. But there was understanding there, a bridge they hadn't known how to build before. "Just promise me something," Kyle said before hanging up. "Promise you'll take care of yourself too. Not just the donkey, I promise. And Dad. Mom would have liked her." "You're right about that." The weather warmed again, the way it often did in New Mexico. Cold one week, mild the next. Amos removed Margaret's blanket and washed it carefully by hand, hanging it in the sun to dry. The wool had held up better than he'd expected, the embroidered flowers still visible despite the wear. He folded it and placed it back in the cedar chest, but it felt different now, less like a shrine and more like a memory he could visit without being trapped by it. Gracie continued to gain strength. By mid-October, she'd filled out enough that her ribs no longer protruded sharply. Her coat, with regular brushing and proper nutrition, had begun to shine in patches. The dullness was fading, replaced by the healthy grey of a young donkey, finally getting what she needed. Her legs had steadied, the wobbling replaced with a confident stride that carried her around the pasture with increasing energy. She'd also developed a personality that surprised Amos daily. She was curious about everything, investigating every corner of her world with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that the world was safe enough to explore. She'd learned to recognize the sound of different vehicles, would bray excitedly when Tom's patrol car pulled up, but ignore other traffic entirely. She'd figured out how to open the latch on the feed bin and had to be caught red-muzzled one morning, having helped herself to extra pellets. She even played in her awkward donkey way, trotting around the pasture with a stick she'd found, tossing it in the air and chasing after it. One evening, as Amos sat on the porch watching the sunset, Gracie wandered over from the pasture. She'd never done this before, had always stayed in her designated areas, respecting the boundaries Amos had established. But now she climbed the porch steps carefully and stood beside his chair, her warm flank pressed against his leg. They stayed like that for a long time. The old cowboy and the foal who wasn't supposed to survive, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to indigo. Amos rested his hand on her neck, feeling her breathe, feeling her alive and real and present. The emptiness that had filled his days for 5 years had receded so gradually he hadn't noticed until now. It wasn't gone. Grief didn't work that way, he knew. But it had made room for something else. For connection, for purpose, for a reason to greet each morning with something other than resignation. "Thank you," he said quietly, not entirely sure if he was speaking to Gracie, to Margaret, or to whatever force had brought them together. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe gratitude didn't need a specific recipient to be real and necessary. Gracie's ear twitched toward him, and she settled down on the porch with a satisfied grunt, her head resting near his boots. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Amos felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness, not yet, but the quiet peace of knowing he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. The work gloves in his pocket, Margaret's blanket now treasured rather than just preserved, and this small life he'd helped save. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that made a life worth living. November brought rain, the kind that turned the roads to mud and made the mornings feel like winter had arrived early. Amos found himself spending more time in the barn, not just because Gracie needed attention, but because the house felt too quiet even now. He'd taken to bringing his old harmonica, an instrument he hadn't touched since Margaret passed. She'd loved when he played. Nothing fancy, just old songs from his youth, melodies that carried memories. The first time he played for Gracie, she'd been startled, her ears swiveling back in alarm. But he'd kept playing softly, a simple tune his father had taught him, and slowly she'd relaxed. Then approached, then stood beside him while he played, her dark eyes half closed, as if the music touched something deep inside her. It became part of their evening routine. After feeding, after brushing, after the day's work was done, Amos would sit on the stool outside her stall and play. Sometimes old folk songs, sometimes hymns, sometimes just whatever came to his fingers. Gracie would stand at the gate, listening with an attention that seemed almost human. On good nights, she'd rest her chin on the top rail, and Amos swore he could see something, like peace in her expression, but peace never lasted as long as he wanted. The first real trouble came when Bobby Strickland's cattle broke, through a fence line and wandered onto Amos's property. Bobby showed up the next morning with 3 of his ranch hands, loud and unapologetic, pushing the cattle back toward his land without so much as a knock on the door. Amos was in the barn with Gracie when he heard the commotion. He came out to find Bobby's crew driving the cattle through his pasture, the same pasture where Gracie had been grazing peacefully minutes before. The foal had retreated to the barn, eyes wide with fear at the sudden invasion of massive animals and shouting men. "Bobby!" Amos called out, walking toward the younger rancher with measured steps. "You got a hole in your fence?" "Yeah, section by the creek. I'll get to it when I get to it. That fence has been weak for 3 months. I mentioned it back in August." Bobby dismounted, his expression dismissive. "It's my fence, my land. I'll fix it on my schedule. Your land stops at the property line. Your cattle on my land is my business." "Oh, come on, Amos. They wandered over, that's all. No harm done. Unless you're worried they'll spook your precious pet." He said the last word, with enough mockery to make his meaning clear. One of the ranch hands laughed. Amos felt heat rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Just fix your fence. Next time your cattle come through, I'll pen them and you'll pay to get them back. That's legal and you know it." Bobby's jaw tightened. You threatening me, old man? I'm telling you how it's going to be. Fix your fence. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other, Bobby young and cocky and used to getting his way. Amos older but carved from harder times and unwilling to back down. Bobby's hands had clenched into fists, and Amos recognized the look. He'd seen it before on young men who thought age meant weakness. "Bobby," one of the ranch hands said quietly. "Come on, let's just get the cattle home." Bobby held Amos's gaze a moment longer, then turned away. "Whatever. We'll be back if they wander over again." "You'll fix the fence," Amos repeated. After they left, Amos went to check on Gracie. She was pressed into the back corner of her stall, trembling. The sight of her fear hit him harder than Bobby's attitude had. All the progress they'd made, all the trust she'd built, and one incident could shake it. He entered the stall slowly, speaking softly. "It's all right now. They're gone. You're safe." But Gracie wouldn't come to him, wouldn't let him close. She stayed in the corner, her breathing rapid, and Amos realized with a sinking feeling that they'd just experienced their first real setback. Whatever trauma she'd carried from her early rejection had been triggered by the chaos of the cattle drive. She was back where they'd started, afraid and convinced the world was dangerous. He didn't push. Instead, he sat down in the straw and pulled out his harmonica. He played the gentlest tune he knew, something his mother had hummed when he was a boy and couldn't sleep. The notes filled the barn, soft and sweet and safe. It took 20 minutes, but gradually Gracie's breathing slowed. Her ears, pinned flat against her head, began to relax. After another 10 minutes, she took a tentative step forward. Then another. By the time Amos finished the song, she was standing beside him, pressing her muzzle against his shoulder in a gesture that broke his heart with its need for reassurance. "I know," he murmured, running his hand along her neck. "I know it was scary, but you're safe here. I promise you're safe." That night, Amos called the county office and filed a formal complaint about Bobby's fence. It wouldn't do much. Rural fence disputes were common and rarely resolved quickly, but it was on record. He also called Tom Hartley and told him what had happened. "Bobby's been trouble since he inherited that ranch," Tom said. "Thinks his family's money means he doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. I'll talk to him, make sure he understands that trespassing and harassment are taken seriously." "I don't want trouble, Tom. I just want to be left alone to do what I'm doing." "I know. But sometimes trouble finds you anyway." The next few days were difficult. Gracie had regressed, skittish and uncertain in ways she hadn't been in weeks. She wouldn't go out to the pasture, refused to be more than a few feet from Amos when he was in the barn, and jumped at every unfamiliar sound. Doc Peterson stopped by to check on her and confirmed what Amos already knew. Physically, she was fine, but the psychological setback was real. Animals with trauma histories can be triggered by unexpected events, Doc explained. The cattle, the shouting, the chaos. It probably reminded her of being rejected, being powerless. "She'll come back from it, but it might take time." "We've got time," Amos said, though he felt the weight of doubt pressing on him. What if Bobby's cattle came through again? What if the next incident was worse? What if all his work, all their progress, could be undone by circumstances beyond his control? That evening, he played his harmonica for longer than usual. Song after song, melody after melody, until his lips were numb and his fingers ached from the cold. Gracie stood at the stall gate the entire time, listening, her eyes locked on his face, as if the music was the only thing keeping her tethered to safety. When he finally stopped, she made a sound, not quite a bray, softer than that, almost questioning. Amos lowered the harmonica and met her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I don't care what Bobby does or what anyone thinks. I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. You hear me, girl? I keep my promises." Gracie's ears came forward, and she pressed her muzzle through the slats of the gate. Amos touched her face gently, feeling the soft warmth of her breath against his palm. They stayed like that for a long time, the old cowboy and the damaged foal, holding on to each other in the quiet barn, while the rain drummed steadily on the roof. The harmonica in Amos's pocket was more than just an instrument now. It was a promise made in melody, a commitment spoken in notes instead of words. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, he would be there. He would play his songs and offer his presence and never give up on the small creature who'd given him a reason to keep going. That had to be enough. That was all he had to give. By late November, Gracie had recovered most of her confidence, though she remained more alert, more watchful than before. Amos had started carrying his father's old pocket watch, a habit he'd abandoned years ago but found himself returning to now. The watch had stopped working decades back, but he kept it for the weight of it. The connection to a man who'd taught him everything about ranching and nothing about expressing emotion. His father, Jacob Rigg, had been a hard man from hard times. Born in 1924, raised during the Depression, shaped by a war he never talked about. He'd run this ranch with iron discipline and quiet competence, expecting the same from his only son. When Amos was 17 and thought he wanted to go to college instead of ranching, his father had handed him this watch. "Time keeps moving," Jacob had said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and dust. "Whether you're ready or not, whether you're doing what you want or what you need to. The question isn't how you spend your time. It's whether you spend it on things that matter when you're out of it." Amos had stayed on the ranch, had never regretted it, though he'd wondered sometimes what other life he might have lived. Now, at 67, with Gracie depending on him and purpose returning to his days, he understood what his father had meant. Time was the one thing you couldn't get back. Using it well mattered more than using it happily. He was thinking about this one afternoon while repairing a section of fence when Kyle's car pulled up the drive. His son emerged looking tired, his suit jacket rumpled from the long drive from Denver. They hadn't seen each other in person since summer. "Dad," Kyle said, accepting Amos's handshake and briefly awkward half-embrace. "Thought I'd drive down, check on things. Things are fine, are they?" Kyle's eyes went to the barn. "I want to see her. The donkey, Gracie." They walked to the barn together, the silence between them comfortable in a way that came from shared genetics rather than shared understanding. Gracie was in her stall, munching hay, and looked up when they entered. She studied Kyle with careful attention, then returned to her food, a level of confidence that pleased Amos. Kyle stared at the foal for a long moment. "She looks better than I expected. She's come a long way. Is that Mom's blanket?" Kyle pointed to the wool blanket folded neatly on a shelf. Gracie uses it when it's cold." Kyle's jaw tightened. "You gave Mom's blanket to a donkey. I gave it to someone who needed it. Your mother would have approved." "You don't know that." "I do, actually. Your mother spent half her life taking in strays. Cats, dogs, that raccoon that time you were 12. She never turned away from something that needed help, and she'd have been out here every day with me if she was still around." Kyle leaned against the stall door, his shoulders sagging. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I'm not angry about the blanket or the donkey. I'm worried about you. You're spending all your time and money on this animal. You're isolated out here. You're getting into disputes with neighbors. This isn't healthy." Amos felt the pocket watch heavy in his vest, his father's lesson about time echoing in his mind. "Kyle, you want to know what isn't healthy? Healthy isn't sitting in an empty house, counting down the days until you die. Healthy isn't going through motions because you don't know what else to do. I was dying inside when I found Gracie. Slowly maybe, but dying. Now I wake up with purpose. Is that really something to worry about? But what happens when she—" Kyle stopped, then forced himself to continue. "What happens when she dies? Because she will die, Dad. Animals don't live forever. And based on what that shelter manager told me when I called her, this one wasn't expected to live at all. When you lose her, what then?" The question hung in the air between them. Amos had asked himself the same thing many times, usually in the dark hours before dawn, when worry felt most real. "Then I'll grieve," he said finally. "Same as I grieved your mother. Same as I'll grieve everything I love and lose. That's the price of caring about anything. Eventually you lose it. But the alternative is caring about nothing, and that's not living. That's just waiting to die." Kyle looked at his father with an expression that combined frustration and something that might have been understanding. "Grandpa Jacob used to say something like that. about the ranch, about the animals. He said if you weren't willing to hurt over what you lost, you weren't really loving what you had. Amos pulled out the pocket watch, held it so Kyle could see. He gave me this when I was your age. Told me time matters. How you spend it matters. I spent 40 good years with your mother. I spent 30 years building this ranch into something we were proud of. And now I'm spending my time giving this foal a chance nobody else would give her. When I'm gone and you're sitting with your own choices, I hope you'll understand that every minute I spent out here was worth it. Can I? Kyle gestured toward the stall. Amos nodded. Kyle entered slowly, extending his hand toward Gracie the way Amos had taught him as a boy with horses. Gracie considered him for a moment, then allowed him to touch her neck. Kyle's hand trembled slightly as he ran it along her coat. "She's soft," he said, surprise in his voice. "I thought she'd be, I don't know, rougher. She's gentle. Scared still sometimes, but gentle." They stood together in the stall. 3 generations of rig values made manifest. Jacob's lesson about time, Amos's belief in second chances, and Kyle slowly learning that worth wasn't always measured in practical outcomes. "I brought something," Kyle said after a while. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. "Found it when I was going through some boxes. Thought you might want it." The photograph showed Margaret in the barn, younger, healthier, smiling as she held a newborn foal in her arms. Amos recognized the moment, 20 years ago, maybe more. The foal had been rejected by its mother, and Margaret had spent 3 weeks nursing it around the clock. The foal it survived had grown into one of the best horses they'd ever owned. "She was always doing this," Kyle said softly, "taking in the broken ones. I'd forgotten that. You were young. You remembered the successes, not the work. Did they all make it? The ones she tried to save? No, she lost more than she saved. But she never stopped trying." Amos took the photograph, holding it carefully. "That's what she taught me. That trying matters even when you fail. Especially when you fail." Kyle stayed for dinner, the first meal they'd shared at the house in over a year. The conversation was easier than it had been, though still marked by the careful navigation of men who loved each other but didn't quite know how to show it. Before he left, Kyle walked out to the barn one more time and stood looking at Gracie. "Take care of him," he told the foal. "He won't admit when he needs help, so you'll have to watch for it." Gracie's ears swiveled toward him, and Amos could swear she understood. After Kyle's taillights disappeared down the drive, Amos sat on the porch with the photograph and the pocket watch, both held loosely in his weathered hands. 2 artifacts from different eras of his life, both pointing to the same truth, that time mattered, that love mattered, that the work of caring for broken things was never wasted even when it broke your heart. Inside the barn, Gracie settled down for the night, wrapped in Margaret's blanket, safe and protected in a way she'd never been before Amos found her. The pocket watch ticked in his imagination, counting down the moments they had left together. However many or few, Amos intended to spend them well. That was all anyone could do. Spend their time on things that mattered, love what needed loving, and accept that loss was the price of having something worth losing. His father had understood that. Margaret had lived it. And now, with Gracie's soft breathing audible through the barn wall, Amos was learning it all over again. December arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of weather that made ranchers nervous. Dry grass, low humidity, and wind that could turn a spark into disaster. Amos had been extra careful with his old kerosene lantern, the one he used when working in the barn after dark. The electrical system was original to the building, installed in 1968, and reliable enough, but dim. The lantern provided better light for detailed work, and he'd used it safely for 40 years. The trouble started on a Friday evening. Bobby Strickland's fence had broken again, or more likely had never been properly fixed, and 6 of his cattle had wandered onto Amos's property. This time, Amos did exactly what he'd promised. He penned the cattle and called Tom Hartley to document it. Bobby would have to pay to get them back. Bobby arrived an hour later, fury written across his face. He'd been drinking, not falling down drunk, but enough that his judgment was impaired and his temper unchecked. "You can't hold my cattle," he shouted from his truck. "That's theft. Amos stood firm on his porch. "It's legal impoundment of trespassing livestock. Tom's got it all documented. Fix your fence and pay the impound fee, and you can have them back. Impound fee. You're going to charge me? $200 plus $50 a day for feed and care. That's standard." Bobby climbed out of his truck with the dangerous energy of a young man who'd never been held accountable for his actions. He stormed toward the porch, and Amos's hand moved instinctively toward his side, where he'd once carried a sidearm in younger, rougher days. But he was unarmed now, had been for years. "You listen to me, old man," Bobby snarled, close enough that Amos could smell whiskey on his breath. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to take my property. And you sure as hell don't get to charge me for your trouble. I'm not arguing with a drunk man. Come back tomorrow when you're sober and we'll settle this proper. We'll settle it now." Bobby's hand shot out and shoved Amos backward. It wasn't a punch, but at 67, with arthritis and age-weakened balance, Amos stumbled. His hip hit the porch railing hard, pain shooting through his side. He caught himself before falling, but barely. The world tilted for a moment, and he heard Gracie's distressed bray from the barn. She'd seen the confrontation, had understood that Amos was in danger. The sound of her fear cut through his own shock and ignited something he hadn't felt in decades. Pure, cold anger. But before Amos could respond, Tom's patrol car came roaring up the drive, lights flashing. Tom was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, his hand on his weapon. "Bobby, step back right now," Tom commanded. "Step back and put your hands where I can see them." The young rancher froze, reality penetrating his whiskey-fueled rage. His hands came up slowly. "He stole my cattle, Tom. You just assaulted a senior citizen on his own property. That's what you just did. Turn around." Tom cuffed Bobby and put him in the patrol car, then came back to check on Amos. "You all right?" "I'll have a bruise, but I'm fine." Amos touched his hip, wincing. "How'd you know to come?" "Saw his truck heading this way, driving erratic. Figured he might be coming here. Good thing I followed." Tom looked toward the patrol car, where Bobby sat with his head in his hands. This is going to have consequences for him. Assault, trespassing, drunk and disorderly. His family's money might keep him out of serious jail time, but it's on his record now. After Tom left with Bobby, Amos went to the barn. Gracie was agitated, pacing her stall, her eyes wide with residual fear. He spent an hour calming her, speaking softly, playing his harmonica until she finally settled. The incident had shaken them both, but they'd gotten through it, or so he thought. That night, Amos woke to Gracie's screams. Not brays, screams, the kind of sound an animal makes when facing death. He was out of bed and running before his mind fully registered what he was hearing. The smell hit him when he opened the front door. Smoke. The barn was on fire. Later, investigators would determine that the old kerosene lantern had been knocked over, whether by vibration from Gracie's earlier agitation or a rat or simple mechanical failure. They couldn't say. The lantern had fallen, the kerosene had spilled, and the dry straw had ignited. By the time Amos reached the barn, flames were climbing the walls near Gracie's stall. He didn't think. Thinking would have meant acknowledging he was 67 years old, running into a burning building. Thinking would have meant calculating risk versus reward. He just ran, pulling his shirt over his mouth and nose, his eyes already watering from the smoke. "Gracie," he shouted. "I'm coming!" The heat was intense, pressing against him like a physical force. The smoke was worse, thick and black and choking. He could barely see 3 feet ahead. The barn he'd known his entire life had become a foreign landscape of fire and shadow. He found Gracie's stall by memory rather than sight. She was pressed against the back wall, paralyzed with terror. The flames hadn't reached her yet, but the smoke had. She was coughing, her eyes rolling white, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. "Come on, girl," Amos gasped, fumbling with the stall latch. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the mechanism. "Come on, we have to go." But Gracie wouldn't move. The same trauma that had marked her since birth had locked her in place. Fire, smoke, chaos. Her mind had shut down, defaulting to freeze instead of flight. Amos tried to lead her out, but she resisted, her weight solid despite her small size. The smoke was getting thicker. His lungs burned. His vision was narrowing to a dark tunnel. He knew with absolute clarity that if he didn't leave now, they would both die. He had one chance. He grabbed Margaret's blanket from the shelf and threw it over Gracie's head, covering her eyes. Sometimes blind animals would follow when they couldn't see the danger. His hands found her halter and he pulled. "Trust me," he coughed. "Gracie, you have to trust me." For one eternal moment, nothing happened. Then Gracie took a step, then another. Blind and terrified, but trusting the voice that had never lied to her, she followed Amos through the smoke and flames toward the barn entrance that seemed impossibly far away. The last 10 feet were the worst. A burning beam had fallen across the path, and Amos had to lead Gracie around it, his body between her and the flames. The heat seared his arms, his back. He felt his shirt catch fire and knew he'd been burned but couldn't stop to deal with it. Then they were through. Out into the night air, both of them collapsing on the grass 20 feet from the barn. Amos rolled to extinguish his burning clothes, gasping for air, his lungs feeling like they'd been scoured with steel wool. Beside him, Gracie lay on her side, coughing violently, the blanket still partially covering her head. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the dark sky. Amos heard sirens in the distance. Someone must have seen the fire and called it in. He tried to stand, couldn't. His legs wouldn't hold him. His vision was graying at the edges. He turned his head toward Gracie, needing to see that she was all right, that getting her out had been worth it. She was watching him, her dark eyes clear despite the smoke staining her face. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a bond forged in fire and survival. Then Gracie did something that would define the rest of their story. Despite her own trauma, despite her fear, despite every instinct telling her to run, she struggled to her feet. She positioned herself next to Amos's prone form, and with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her young body, she began pulling at his jacket collar with her teeth. "What are you doing?" Amos tried to say, but his voice was gone. Gracie pulled harder, her small hooves scrabbling in the grass as she tried to drag him further from the burning barn. She was too small, he was too heavy, but she didn't stop. She pulled and braced and pulled again, her breath coming in harsh gasps, her entire being focused on moving the man who'd saved her. Amos felt himself being dragged a few inches, then a few more. The foal everyone had said wouldn't survive, the broken creature nobody wanted, was trying to save his life. "Good girl," he whispered. "That's my good girl." The sirens were closer now. Fire trucks, ambulances. Gracie kept pulling until the paramedics arrived and gently moved her aside. Amos's last conscious memory before they put him on the stretcher was seeing Gracie standing guard over him. Margaret's singed blanket still trailing from her shoulders, her eyes fierce with protective determination. The broken foal had saved her broken cowboy, and in doing so, she'd proven what Amos had believed from the moment he first saw those sad eyes in the shelter. That worth wasn't about what you could do in perfect conditions. It was about what you chose to do when everything was falling apart. Amos woke in the hospital to bright lights and the steady beep of monitors. His throat felt like sandpaper, his lungs burned with every breath, and his arms were wrapped in bandages from the burns. But he was alive. Tom Hartley was sitting beside the bed, his hat in his hands, his face lined with worry. When he saw Amos's eyes open, relief flooded his features. "Welcome back," Tom said quietly. "You gave us a scare." Amos tried to speak, managed only a rasp. Tom held up a hand and passed him a cup with a straw. "The water was the best thing Amos had ever tasted." "Gracie," he finally croaked. "She's fine. Caroline came and got her, has her at the shelter in a special pen. Vet checked her out. Some smoke inhalation, minor burns on her legs, but nothing serious. She's eating, drinking, responsive." Tom paused. "Amos, she tried to drag you away from that fire. The paramedic said if she hadn't pulled you those extra few feet, the heat exposure would have been worse." The memory flooded back. Gracie's teeth on his collar, her determined effort to move him despite her fear and trauma. The Foal, who'd been too broken to save, had saved him. How long have I been here? 2 days. Smoke inhalation, second-degree burns on your arms and back, severe dehydration. The doctors want to keep you at least another 3 days for observation. The barn. Tom's expression darkened. Total loss. Fire department got it contained before it spread to the house, but the barn's gone. And Amos, he hesitated. The investigators found evidence of accelerant near where the fire started. They think someone poured kerosene deliberately. Amos's blood went cold, despite the warm hospital room. Bobby, we don't know that for certain. He has an alibi, was in county lockup when the fire started. But his ranch hands, well, that's a different story. One of them, Ray Hutchins, was seen driving near your property around the time the fire would have been set. We're investigating, but it's complicated, so Bobby pays someone to burn down my barn while he sits in a cell establishing an alibi. Like I said, we're investigating. Bobby's father has hired lawyers, and they're making a lot of noise about proof and due process. Tom leaned forward. But here's the thing. The story about Gracie trying to save you, it's gotten out. Someone at the fire department talked to the newspaper. Now everyone in the county knows about the foal nobody wanted, who refused to leave the man who saved her. Over the next several days, as Amos recovered, he discovered what Tom meant. The Lonesome Bluff Gazette had run the story on the front page. Miracle Foal rescues rancher from barn fire. The article included the photograph Kyle had given him, Margaret with the newborn foal, and recent pictures someone had taken of Gracie at the shelter. The piece told the whole story, the rejection, the adoption, the slow recovery, and finally the dramatic rescue. The response was overwhelming. Cards arrived by the dozen, from people in town, from neighboring counties, from people who'd heard the story secondhand and felt moved to reach out. Caroline brought them to the hospital in shopping bags, her eyes misty. "I've never seen anything like it," she said. "People are calling the shelter, asking how they can help. We've received donations totaling over $15,000 specifically for Gracie's care and for rebuilding your barn. The feed store is donating supplies. The lumberyard is offering materials at cost." Amos stared at the cards spread across his hospital bed. Messages from strangers who'd been touched by a story of second chances and unlikely heroism. Letters from elderly people who said Gracie had reminded them that it was never too late to matter. Notes from parents who'd read the story to their children as a lesson about judging others by their potential rather than their appearance. "There's something else," Caroline said, her voice careful. "We've had about 24 people come to the shelter wanting to adopt animals, specifically the ones like Gracie, the rejects, the ones with health issues, the ones nobody else wants. They all said the same thing. If that little foal could turn out to be a hero, maybe their animal could too." Amos felt his throat tighten. Gracie's story wasn't just about one foal anymore. It had become something larger, a reminder that worth wasn't always visible on the surface. Kyle arrived on the 4th day, driving straight from Denver when he heard about the fire. He walked into the hospital room, with controlled panic barely concealed behind his composure. When he saw Amos sitting up eating solid food, the facade cracked. "Dad," was all he managed before his voice broke. They talked for hours, the longest conversation they'd had since Kyle was a teenager. Amos told him everything about the fire, about Gracie's rescue, about waking up to find his small, scared foal trying desperately to save him. Kyle listened with tears streaming down his face. "I almost lost you," Kyle said finally. "And I would have lost you while thinking you'd wasted your last years on something that didn't matter. But it did matter, didn't it? All of it mattered. Every minute," Amos confirmed. "The barn can be rebuilt. The donations, plus what I've been saving, it'll be enough. Better than before, actually. Modern electrical, proper ventilation, everything up to code." Kyle pulled out his phone and showed Amos pictures he'd already been looking at. "I've been talking to contractors. They can start as soon as you're released and give approval. Kyle, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You spent 30 years building something you were proud of, and it burned down. But more than that, you spent the last few months building something even more important. You gave that foal a reason to live, and in return, she gave you one too. That's worth rebuilding for? On the 6th day, Doc Peterson brought Gracie to visit. Hospital policy technically didn't allow it, but the staff had heard the story and looked the other way as the old veterinarian led the foal down the corridor to Amos's room. Gracie's hooves clicked on the linoleum, her ears swiveling at all the unfamiliar sounds and smells. When she entered the room and saw Amos, something shifted in her eyes. She pulled away from Doc, walked straight to the bed, and pressed her muzzle against Amos's hand. The sound she made was soft, questioning as if asking if he was all right. "I'm okay, girl," Amos said, his voice still rough but stronger. "Thanks to you, I'm okay." Gracie's ears came forward, and she stayed pressed against the bed, occasionally snuffling at his hand or his face, checking him with the thoroughness of someone who'd been desperately worried. Several nurses had gathered in the doorway, watching the reunion with undisguised emotion. "She hasn't been the same since the fire," Doc said quietly. "Won't eat much, keeps looking for you." Caroline's been worried, but look at her now. Indeed, Gracie had transformed the moment she'd seen Amos. The anxiety that had marked her behavior at the shelter had vanished, replaced with the calm certainty of being exactly where she needed to be. "When can I take her home?" Amos asked. "When there's a home to take her to," Doc replied. "The house is fine, but you can't keep her there. Soon as the barn's rebuilt, she's all yours. In the meantime, she's got a good setup at the shelter. Caroline's taking personal care of her." 2 days later, the Gazette ran another story. "Community rallies to rebuild Rancher's barn." The article detailed the donations that had poured in, the volunteers who'd offered labor, the businesses providing materials at cost. Bobby Strickland's father had even, perhaps motivated by his son's legal troubles, made a substantial anonymous donation that everyone knew about anyway. The investigation into the fire was ongoing, but public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Bobby had become a pariah, his family's reputation tarnished by the presumption of guilt, even without proof. Ray Hutchins, the ranch hand who'd been seen near Amos's property, had lawyered up and wasn't talking. The truth might never be fully proven in court, but everyone knew what had likely happened. The day Amos was discharged, half the town seemed to be at his property. Volunteers had already cleared the burned barn's remains and laid the foundation for the new structure. The speed was remarkable, driven by genuine affection for Amos and fascination with Gracie's story. People who'd never spoken to him before showed up with tools and energy, wanting to be part of rebuilding something good. Tom helped Amos into a chair they'd set up in the yard, where he could watch the work without being in the way. His arms were still bandaged, his breathing still labored, but the doctors had cleared him to go home with strict instructions to rest and let others do the heavy lifting. "Quite a turnout," Tom observed. "Never expected this. People need things to believe in. Amos, especially in hard times. Your story with Gracie, it reminds folks that good things can happen when you don't give up, that broken things can heal, that second chances matter." Throughout the day, people came to sit with Amos, to shake his hand, or just to be near someone who'd become something of a local legend. Old ranchers who'd known him for decades, young families who'd heard the story, children who wanted to know when they could meet the hero donkey. Amos was uncomfortable with the attention, but gracious in accepting it, understanding that this wasn't really about him. It was about what his and Gracie's story represented. As the sun began to set, painting the worksite in gold and amber light, the barn's frame was already rising. It would be weeks before it was complete, but the skeleton was there, stronger than before. Built with care by people who understood what it meant to Amos, and by extension, to Gracie. Caroline arrived with Gracie in her trailer just as the workers were packing up for the day. When the foal emerged and saw Amos, she gave a joyful bray and trotted straight to him, careful around his chair, nuzzling him with the gentleness of someone who knew he was still healing. "Welcome home, girl," Amos whispered, his hand on her neck. "Welcome home." The crowd that had gathered to watch the reunion burst into spontaneous applause. Gracie's ears swiveled nervously at the noise, but she didn't move from Amos's side. She'd found her place, and no amount of attention or noise would make her leave it. That night, with Gracie settled in a temporary pen they'd built near the house, Amos sat on his porch and looked at what his community had begun to create. The new barn would be better than the old one, safer, more functional, built with modern understanding and ancient care. But more than that, it would stand as a monument to what happened when people came together around something that mattered. A broken foal and a lonely old man had become a story about resilience, about the courage to try even when success seemed impossible, about the way love could manifest in the most unexpected places. As Amos sat in the gathering darkness, listening to Gracie's soft breathing from her pen, he understood that they'd both been saved. Not from the fire, that had just been the dramatic moment everyone would remember. They'd been saved from something worse, the quiet death of purpose, the slow fade into irrelevance, the belief that their best days were behind them. Instead, their best days were just beginning. 3 weeks later, on a clear Saturday morning in January, the new barn stood complete. It was beautiful in a way the old barn had never been. Straight lines, fresh paint, modern fixtures that gleamed in the morning sun. But it also carried echoes of what had come before. The contractors had salvaged what they could from the original structure. A few beams that hadn't burned, the iron hinges from the main door, the weather vane that had sat atop the roof since 1942. These pieces of history had been incorporated into the new design, bridges between past and present. The town had organized a dedication ceremony. Amos had tried to discourage it, uncomfortable with the fuss, but Caroline and Tom had overruled him. This wasn't just about his barn, they explained. It was about what the community had built together, what Gracie's story had inspired. People needed to celebrate that. So Amos stood near the barn entrance, dressed in his best shirt with his burns mostly healed, greeting what felt like half the county. Gracie was beside him, wearing a halter that someone had made specially for her, soft leather with small flowers tooled into it, a gift from the woman who ran the leather goods shop in town. The foal stood calmly, despite the crowd, her confidence a far cry from the trembling creature who'd arrived at his ranch 5 months before. The mayor spoke, though Amos barely heard the words. Something about community spirit and resilience, about how one man's kindness and one animal's courage had reminded them all of what mattered. Caroline spoke next, her voice breaking with emotion as she described finding Gracie in that back pen, dying and alone, and Amos's decision to take a chance nobody else would take. Then Tom stepped forward with something covered in cloth. When he pulled the covering away, Amos felt his breath catch. It was a brass plaque, simple but elegant, with words that would be mounted beside the barn door. Rigg Family Barn Rebuilt, January 2024. In honor of second chances, unexpected heroes, and the belief that every life has value. Margaret Rigg would have been proud. Amos had to look away for a moment, blinking against tears he didn't want the crowd to see. Margaret's name on that plaque meant more than any of them could know. She was part of this story, part of what had brought him to that shelter, part of what had taught him to see value where others saw weakness. And now, Tom said, we have one more surprise. Caroline led a group of people forward, each carrying something. 5 donkeys of various ages and conditions, all from the shelter, all rejects like Gracie had been. Behind them came their new owners, the people who'd been inspired by Gracie's story to take a chance on an animal nobody else wanted. These are Gracie's legacy, Caroline explained, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Every one of these donkeys was scheduled to be put down, but because people heard about what Gracie did, about what she became when someone believed in her, they decided to take that chance themselves. That's 5 lives saved because of one cowboy's decision to see potential instead of problems. The owners stepped forward one by one, introducing their animals and sharing their stories. A retired schoolteacher with a blind donkey, she was training to respond to voice commands. A young veteran with PTSD who'd found peace in caring for an elderly donkey, rejected for being too old to work. a widower not much younger than Amos with a donkey that had severe anxiety, the two of them healing together in their isolation. Each story was different, but the core was the same. Gracie had shown them that broken didn't mean worthless, that patience could accomplish what force never could, that sometimes the things others discarded held the most value. After the speeches, people toured the barn, admiring the craftsmanship and the thoughtful details. The stall that had been Copper's, that had become Gracie's, had been rebuilt exactly as it was before, except better, safer, with the kind of careful attention that came from love rather than just function. Someone had brought food, potluck style, the way small communities did things, and tables were set up in the yard. Children played carefully around Gracie, who tolerated their attention with patient grace. She'd become something of a celebrity, and while Amos worried the attention might overwhelm her, she seemed to understand that these people meant well. She accepted their gentle touches and soft words with the dignity of someone who'd learned she was worthy of admiration. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, each person stopped to say goodbye to Amos and Gracie. A thank you, a handshake, a moment of connection. The older ranchers, men who'd known Amos's father and grandfather, gripped his hand with particular firmness, their weathered faces showing respect that went beyond words. When most of the crowd had dispersed, Bobby Strickland's father appeared. He was an older version of his son, but with eyes that held more wisdom and a lot more regret. He stood for a moment before speaking. "I can't undo what Bobby did," he said quietly. "The lawyers say there's not enough evidence to prosecute, but we both know the truth. What I can do is tell you I'm sorry. My boy was raised better than this, and somewhere along the way, I failed to make sure those lessons stuck." Amos studied the older man, seeing genuine remorse rather than strategic apology. "Your donation helped build this barn. It's the least I could do. Though I suspect the harm goes deeper than what money can fix. Maybe, but accepting the apology is a start." They shook hands. Two old men, understanding that pride was expensive and forgiveness was sometimes the only way forward. After he left, Amos stood alone with Gracie in front of the new barn, the brass plaque gleaming in the afternoon light. "We did it," he said to Gracie. "Against all odds, we made it through." Gracie bumped his shoulder with her nose. Her way of agreeing. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of purple and gold, Amos led Gracie into the new barn for the first time. The foal hesitated at the entrance, her nostrils flaring as she took in the unfamiliar smells. Fresh wood, new paint, clean straw. Nothing here held the memory of the fire, of smoke and fear and chaos. This was different. This was possibility. "Go on," Amos encouraged gently. "It's yours. It's ours." Gracie took a tentative step across the threshold, then another. Her hooves made different sounds on this floor, sharper, cleaner, echoing slightly in the spacious interior. She walked slowly through the center aisle, investigating everything with the careful attention of someone cataloging a new world. Past the tack room with its organized shelves, past the feed storage with its tight ceiling bins, past the 3 empty stalls that waited for whatever future might bring. Then she reached her stall, the one that had been rebuilt in the exact dimensions of the original, but improved in every way. Better ventilation, smoother walls, a gate that swung on perfectly balanced hinges. Amos had supervised this part of the construction personally, ensuring every detail was right. On the wall inside, someone had mounted a small shelf, and on that shelf sat Margaret's blanket, folded neatly, waiting. Gracie entered the stall and stood in the center, turning in a slow circle. Then she looked back at Amos, and he could swear he saw understanding in her eyes. This was home. Not just shelter, not just a safe place to sleep, but home in the deepest sense, a space built with love for her, where she belonged. Amos prepared her evening meal with the same careful attention he'd given every feeding since that first day. The special formula was no longer necessary. Gracie had graduated to regular feed mixed with supplements, but the ritual remained important. He brought the bucket to her stall and watched as she ate with the healthy appetite of an animal who knew she was safe. While she ate, Amos sat on the stool outside her stall and pulled out his harmonica. He played the first song he'd ever played for her, that simple melody his father had taught him. The notes filled the new barn, different from how they'd sounded in the old one, but somehow right. As if the music had found a better home too. Gracie finished eating and came to the stall gate, resting her chin on the top rail the way she always did when he played. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing steady and peaceful. This moment, Amos realized, was what they'd been working toward all along. Not the dramatic rescue from the fire, not the community recognition, but this simple evening peace, a healthy animal in a safe home. Contentment in the ordinary miracle of survival. When he finished playing, Amos stood and entered Gracie's stall. He ran his hands along her neck, feeling the muscle that had developed beneath her coat, the warmth of her living body. She was no longer the skeletal, dying foal from the shelter. She was strong now, healthy, full of life and personality and courage. The transformation was complete. "You know what I realized today?" he said softly. "Everyone thinks I saved you. The newspaper, the town, all those people who came by. They all think this story is about an old cowboy rescuing a broken foal. But that's only half true, isn't it?" Gracie's ear swiveled toward him, listening. "You saved me just as much. More, maybe. I was dying too when I found you. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I'd given up on purpose, on meaning, on the idea that there was any point to waking up each morning. Then you came into my life and suddenly I had a reason, someone depending on me, someone who needed what I had to give." He paused, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected. "You gave me my life back, Gracie. When you pulled me away from that fire, you weren't just saving me from the flames. You were reminding me why living matters, why fighting for another day matters, why every single moment we have is precious." Gracie pressed her forehead against his chest, a gesture of affection they'd developed over the months. Amos wrapped his arms around her neck, carefully, because his burns still ached sometimes, and they stood like that in the quiet barn. Two survivors who'd found each other at exactly the right moment. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. Stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over this land for millennia, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But inside the barn, something profound had happened. Two damaged souls had found healing in each other, had proven that worth wasn't determined by age or trauma or what others believed. Worth was determined by heart, by the willingness to keep trying, by the courage to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Amos stayed in the barn until Gracie settled down for the night, wrapped in Margaret's blanket, safe and warm and loved. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, looking back at the small figure curled in the clean straw. The brass plaque beside the door caught the moonlight, a reminder of why they'd rebuilt, what they'd overcome, what they meant to each other and to everyone who'd heard their story. Then he walked to the house, his footsteps steady, his heart fuller than it had been in 5 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments to face, new opportunities to prove that second chances weren't just possible. They were worth fighting for with everything you had. He'd learned that lesson from a foal everyone had written off as hopeless, and he'd carry it with him for whatever time remained. Spring came early that year, painting the New Mexico landscape in unexpected green. The winter rains had been generous, and wildflowers dotted the pasture where Gracie spent her mornings, exploring with the confidence of someone who knew she was home. Amos sat on his porch most mornings now, watching her with the quiet satisfaction of work well done. His burns had healed, leaving scars on his arms that he wore without shame. They were reminders of the night everything changed, proof that sometimes you had to walk through fire to reach the other side. The photograph sat on the table beside him, the one taken at the barn dedication. Someone with a good camera had captured the moment Gracie had pressed her forehead against his chest, both of them backlit by the afternoon sun, the new barn standing behind them like a promise kept. Caroline had brought him a framed copy, and it lived on his mantel now, replacing the formal wedding photo that had occupied that space for 30 years. Margaret's picture had moved to his nightstand, closer, more personal, a private memory rather than a public declaration. Kyle called every week now, sometimes twice. Their conversations had grown easier, more genuine, as if the fire had burned away the awkwardness that had built up over years of distance. He'd started bringing his own family down once a month, his wife Sarah and their 2 girls, 8 and 10, who'd become obsessed with Gracie and the story of her rescue. The Foal tolerated their attention with patient grace, seeming to understand that children needed gentle examples of resilience. "The girls want to know if we can get a donkey," Kyle had said on his last visit, shaking his head with amused resignation. They've been researching rescue organizations, making charts about responsibility and care requirements. "I think they're serious," Amos had smiled. "Your mother did the same thing when she was that age. Her parents said no, so she volunteered at every animal shelter within 20 miles until they gave in. Persistence runs in families." "So does stubbornness," Kyle had replied, but his eyes had been warm. "I'm actually considering it. There's a small farm property near Denver I've been looking at. More space, better for the girls to grow up. And if we're going to have land, it should have animals that mean something." The idea of his granddaughters learning the same lessons Gracie had taught him filled Amos with a contentment he hadn't known he needed. Legacy wasn't just about passing on property or teaching skills. It was about sharing values, the belief that every life mattered, that patience and care could heal deep wounds, that giving up on something because it looked hopeless was the real failure. Tom Hartley stopped by most afternoons, often bringing his wife Martha, who'd become friends with Amos in the months since the fire. They'd sit on the porch and share coffee, talking about everything and nothing. The easy companionship of people who'd lived long enough to know that community mattered more than privacy. Bobby left town, Tom mentioned one April afternoon. His father sold him a small ranch in Colorado, said it was time for a fresh start, away from his reputation here. "Think he learned anything?" Amos asked. "Hard to say. Some people learn from their mistakes. Others just move them to new locations. But his father's making restitution to the families affected by Bobby's actions over the years, trying to clean up the mess before it defines their name permanently. We all leave messes," Amos observed. "Question is whether we stick around to clean them up or run from them." The shelter had thrived in the months after Gracie's story spread. Adoptions were up 70%, with people specifically seeking out the animals that needed the most care. Caroline had hired 2 additional staff members to handle the increased activity and had expanded the facility to accommodate more animals. She credited Gracie with changing the way people thought about rescue animals, from charity cases to potential heroes waiting for their chance. Doc Peterson had started teaching a class on animal rehabilitation at the community college. Using Gracie's case as a primary example, "She's literally in the textbook now," he'd told Amos with evident pride. Case study in how psychological trauma affects physical health and vice versa. How the right environment and consistent care can overcome what looks like biological impossibility. Amos didn't fully understand all the medical terms, but he understood the core truth, that love and patience weren't soft sentiments. They were powerful forces that could literally save lives. On warm evenings, Amos still played his harmonica in the barn. Gracie still listened with that same attentive peace, though now other animals sometimes joined them. The barn housed 3 rescue horses now, older animals that had ended up at the shelter with nowhere else to go. Amos had the space, the time, and the knowledge. Taking them in had felt natural, an extension of what Gracie had started. The empty stall wasn't empty anymore. Neither was his life. Neither was his heart. One Sunday morning in late May, Kyle arrived with his family and a surprise, a video camera. "The girls' school is doing a project on local heroes," he explained. "They want to interview you and film Gracie for their presentation." I told them I'd ask. Amos had been reluctant, but his granddaughter's enthusiasm won him over. They set up in the pasture, the new barn visible in the background, and asked him questions with endearing seriousness. What made him decide to adopt Gracie? What was it like when she saved him from the fire? What would he tell other people who thought something was too broken to save? He'd answered honestly, choosing his words carefully for young ears. But his last answer felt like the truest thing he'd said in years. Everyone's got value, even when they can't see it themselves. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in them long enough for them to start believing too. Gracie taught me that. She reminds me every day that it's never too late for second chances, and you're never too old or too damaged to make a difference. That's worth remembering no matter how old you get. After they filmed, the girls spent an hour with Gracie, brushing her coat and feeding her treats, their laughter carrying across the pasture. Amos watched from the porch with Kyle beside him. 3 generations of rig men witnessing the simple joy of connection between children and an animal who'd learned to trust again. "Thanks, Dad," Kyle said quietly, "for showing them this. For showing all of us I didn't do much. Just gave her a chance. That's more than most people would have done. And look what came from it." Amos looked at his son and granddaughters, at the barn that stood where ashes had been, at the foal who'd become strong and confident and loved, at a life that had seemed over but had somehow found new purpose, at a story that had started with sadness and rejection but had ended with connection and hope. "Yeah," he said softly. "Look what came from it." As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in impossible colors, Amos stood by the pasture fence, watching Gracie graze. She was no longer the saddest foal in the shelter. She was healthy, happy, and whole, a testament to what was possible when you refused to give up on something worth saving. And standing there in the gathering twilight, his family inside the house preparing dinner, his barn full of animals who'd found second chances, his days full of meaning and purpose. Amos Rigg understood something profound. He wasn't the one who'd done the saving. They'd saved each other. And in doing so, they'd shown an entire community that sometimes the most broken things hold the most beautiful potential. All you have to do is believe long enough to see it bloom.